Welcome back, and today we are going to talk about the dismissive avoidant attachment style. So, if you've been on social media and you've gotten onto the attachment algorithm, at this point you know that social media portrays this group as the group social media loves to hate. And I do understand where that philosophy might come from. A lot of people do not understand the dismissive avoidance deactivation or the discards that come with it. And the reality is, when they do these things, it severely injures their partner's emotional response. So I do understand why so many people dislike this group, but for me personally, these are my favorite people, and I find them to be very fascinating. So while I'm presenting this information, some of this is coming from information that I have learned through the research that I've done, but also some of it is coming from personal experience. So we'll get into it starting with the blueprint. So when it comes to the dismissive avoidance blueprint, one of the key things to really understand is that in childhood, their emotional experience was actually dismissed. And I'll give you a couple of examples of how I've seen this so this way you can understand what I mean by their emotional experience was dismissed. So, first of all, I'll start with my own parenting. We're not here to bash or judge anybody, and I do believe in taking accountability for when I've screwed up. So, I'll share my experience of what I did that helped create avoidant children. So, one of my daughters was having problems with a young lady from school. There was some social issues, and if you've known anything about middle school girls, this is a whole different world. It's a very different experience for some reason with the social interactions. So my daughter was having a problem with one of the other girls, and she would come home and her day would be like really ruined by whatever social event happened at school. And over time, in the beginning, I tried to help her solve the problem. I never actually paused to talk to her about what her experience was like, the emotions, the feelings, the meaning she was making behind all of this. Instead, I tried to fix the problem with her. As time went on, I really lost my patience with what was going on. She hasn't taken any of my advice. Why are we bothering to continue this? Why are you still trying to be friends with this girl? And when my daughter would come home really upset by these social interactions, I really brushed it off. Was kind of like, well, you're choosing to be friends with her, so you're choosing to stay in this problem. And again, it was just completely not even acknowledging what she was feeling, what she was experiencing, the emotions, the meaning she was constructing to all of this. What did it really mean to her to potentially lose this friendship or choose to walk away from this friendship? So that kind of dismissiveness certainly did not encourage the type of relationship where she probably felt like it was safe to eventually come back home with problems or discuss what was going on. Now, I'd like to believe that we've repaired some of that, but it's probably not completely repaired because, again, this blueprint started from when she was young, and even my parents told me, you let babies cry out their issues in their crib, it's fine, they'll get over it, they'll learn to self-soothe. That's not entirely true. Babies do need to know that when they cry, even if it's just for emotional comfort, that their caregivers are actually going to be there for them. So I let my kids cry it out in the rocker or the crib or wherever they were until they self-soothed. So none of these experiences helped give my kids the best foundation for a secure attachment. That's why they have the attachment styles that they do. But then I've even seen this now as an adult. Back when I was dating, and yes, I'm choosing not to date at the moment and have reasons for that, but I was dating with this partner and we had done something that was a very similar activity. There was only two differences. One was the people that were involved, and two was our gender. And we were chatting, family, kind of socializing, and their parent was praising me for accomplishing this thing that had occurred. And when my partner spoke up and said, hey, I did the same thing, and I thought that was difficult too, their parent really just dismissed their experience and was like, well, yeah, it's just different because, you're a guy and she's a girl. Again, that dismissal is invalidating the person's experience, not paying attention to it, not acknowledging the feelings, the emotions, the meaning that goes behind all of this. So when you look at this dismissive parenting that these children get, we can understand why that they're going to have this blueprint where they do have this high view of themselves, this positive view of themselves, that they are lovable and they can get their needs met in a relationship. My suspicion is that the thought process is, I'll get my needs met because I'll meet them myself. I got this. You don't have to worry about me. But they have a low working model of others, meaning that others are not trustworthy. Others are not going to show up when I need them to be. I can't depend on other people to be there. So when we look at this blueprint of dismissive parenting that leads to a positive working model of self and a low working model of others, we're going to see how this sets up for them to show up in relationships and why this actually does create some obstacles for them going throughout life. So when it comes to understanding the dismissive avoidance dance, it is a little bit different than the anxious preoccupied or the secure attached individuals. I know that the adult attachment interview is one of the gold standards in trying to define attachment styles, but I haven't been trained on that, so I don't use it. Instead, I use the revised adult attachment scale by Collins and Reed because I like the fact that it's very quantifiable. I do like data, and I do like the fact that we can place numbers and values on things so we can measure differences. So when it comes to trying to identify attachment styles, that's the method that I actually like, but years of experience and knowing these individuals, their behavior is kind of very patterned and you can kind of see it pop up. The difficult part I find is finding it popping up in relationships. I can usually see it a little bit better in friendships and when I'm talking to people. So for these individuals, they measure very low on a need for closeness. They actually do not need emotional closeness. That's actually kind of triggering for them. They also measure very low on need for dependency. They don't like being dependent on others. That's probably going to be very triggering for them. But unlike the anxious preoccupied, they have a very low relationship anxiety. So they are not wondering, what's going to happen if they lose this relationship because their relationship anxiety is low. They know how to be very self-sufficient and they know how to take care of themselves very well. And they do that a lot of times through emotional suppression. And while suppression isn't necessarily a good thing, it does actually have its benefits at times. But when it comes to a romantic relationship, emotional suppression is not usually the best way to go into this relationship. So when you have an individual who has this low need for closeness, this low need for interdependence, this low relationship anxiety, you're going to see a dismissive avoidant. And when we talk about the dance, we're not talking about the two-person dance that's going to go on, which we'll talk about when we discuss EFT and how we actually work with couples in therapy. This is really what's kind of going on as an individual, this dance that they're doing by themselves. So again, this is just a very independent, hyper-independent, self-reliant person that's really good at emotional suppression skills. Okay, so when it comes to dismissive avoidance in relationships, now for perspective, when I did the video on the anxious preoccupied, I explained that about 25% of my relationships had been with anxious preoccupied. About 50% of my relationships have been with dismissive avoidance. And as much as I love them, yes, they wreck my heart every single time because those discards are just absolutely emotionally shattering. They really kind of wreck your system. But they are lots of fun to be in relationships with, and they can show up looking so secure at the beginning of the relationship. However, what you'll see are some things that are going to pop up throughout the course of the relationship. So remember that their triggers aren't going to really get activated until the attachment bond forms. And while the attachment bond can start pretty early in the relationship, I don't usually see it showing up until about 3 to 4 months into the relationship. And if you know anything about dismissive avoidance, this is usually when they bail in the relationship, between that 3 to 6 month. And even if they are able to stay in the relationship, at 6 months, you'll probably see some subtle shifts that you're kind of scratching your head wondering what's going on, and then later on is when the discard will come in. But when you track it back, you'll start to see this stuff around 3 to 6 months. So they're kind of an interesting and very predictable pattern. So one of the things is communication difficulties. They are great conversationalists from what I've discovered. I love talking to them. You can talk about anything, whether it's, religion, politics, social events going on, activities that you like. They are great conversationalists. I love talking to them. However, don't expect to go too deep below the surface. If you want to know their emotional experience, or if you want to know how they're feeling, what their emotions are, the response you're probably going to get is, I don't know, or some sort of deflection completely off the topic. And it makes me laugh. The one gentleman that I was in a relationship with, we were laying in bed and he looked like he was very deep in thought. And I asked him, I go, what are you thinking about? Should have known better because that was a deep question. And he's like, I don't know how to dust the fan. So we had that conversation, but it was very clear that he was deep in thought, and I'm sure it wasn't over the fan dust. But they're going to deflect. They're going to give you the answer of, I don't know. How are you feeling right now? I don't know. What are your feelings towards me? I don't know. Or you're just going to get like a change of topic or something very surface level. They're also known for their conflict avoidance. They do want peaceful relationships. I think a lot of people do want to have peace in their relationship. They don't want a lot of commotion. But secure individuals are willing to approach conflict because conflict doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the end of the relationship. And it also doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be a big problem. It's an opportunity to grow and strengthen the relationship for them. But for a dismissive avoidant, it can really kind of just hit on some of those inner wounds that they have, whether it's a rejection, a fear of loss of the relationship, some sort of message that they're not good enough, or that there's something wrong with them, or that their partner might leave, so I need to leave first. Ultimately, they don't like conflict. Conflict is going to probably trigger them, and they may go into a full deactivation and then discard the relationship and exit it. So they don't like conflict. And so they kind of seem a little bit like peacekeepers. But even if they're trying to keep the peace and they're people pleasing just to kind of get through this conflict and get it over with, silently a lot of times they're building up resentment, which can lead to an exiting of the relationship later on anyway. They're also going to have some challenges in repairing that relationship because, again, that's a very emotionally deep thing to do. To have to take accountability for our own errors can be really challenging, but then especially if we're triggered and our nervous system is really in that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response, you can't always clearly understand the other person's perspective. And if they're triggered by the conflict and they're in that response, the ability to understand where their partner is coming from or take any accountability for their part might be really challenging. So conflict repair can actually be a little bit of a struggle for them. You could absolutely see John Gottman's horseman probably coming up in this in the terms of like stonewalling. Like, we're not discussing this anymore. This conversation is done. And I've had that one happen before where I've tried to approach something that was really upsetting me and that I really just needed to discuss and have been told flat out, I don't want to discuss this anymore. This conversation is done. That's great. It's done for you. It's not done for me. And so now there's something kind of building in the background of this relationship. While they have emotional suppression skills that will look like their own self-regulation, the reality is they're not really self-regulating. They're actually emotionally suppressing. But then they don't always have the co-regulation skills to be present to help their partner actually regulate their partner's nervous system. And then, of course, one of the things that they're most well known for are the discards. And I will talk about the discards in a totally different video, but for this purpose, just kind of understanding what you might see in a relationship, the discards are definitely a possibility and a high likelihood. So if you're looking back on your relationships and you're trying to kind of put all of this into perspective, if you were discarded, kind of take a look and see if maybe there were some other patterns there that were dismissive avoidance, and if a lot of your relationships have ended like this, Are you getting into a pattern where you are getting into relationships with dismissive avoidance? It's your own accountability to take. So when it comes to switching your attachment style or earning your attachment security from a dismissive avoidant attachment style, I've heard people say on social media that dismissive avoidants don't do well in therapy, that it's going to be more difficult for them to switch, and I haven't seen any data yet to support that. I haven't really been looking for it either, but here's what I am going to say. So when somebody has decided that they're going to make changes in their life and they commit to that change process, knowing that it's going to be painful, knowing that it's going to be difficult, willing to be vulnerable with themselves and really closely examine what's going on, they're going to make changes. They're actually going to commit to that process. So I think for a dismissive avoidant who wants to earn their secure attachment style, they're going to do it if that's what they really want to do. It just might take some catalysts to get to that point. So I would say that if this is something that you want, don't be scared off by things that are said on social media. If this is what you want, go chase it. You might want some goals to kind of help you out to start with. So first things first, learn to work with connecting with your emotions. One of the biggest things that I found to be incredibly helpful was the use of the feelings wheel. Now you can look this up online to kind of get an idea of what I'm talking about, but if you know anything about emotional suppression, it's not uncommon to turn around and somebody says, "How do you feel?" I don't know. The number of times my therapist has asked me how I felt about something, and my answer is, "I don't know," is unbelievably high. The reality is I just don't know how I feel in that moment because I wasn't allowed to feel when I was younger. So to ask me to identify something that I haven't had any experience with is really difficult, and I don't have an answer. But I find that when you give people multiple choice options opposed to an open-ended question, it's a little bit easier to kind of actually narrow down and generate an answer. So when you ask somebody how they feel, the answer might be, "I don't know." But if you give them a feelings wheel and say which one of these most closely aligns with what you're feeling right now, they'll probably be able to lock in an answer. So if you're a dismissive avoidant and you're trying to connect with your emotions and you're struggling with this, go ahead, go online, pull up a feelings wheel and start working with that. Or when you go to therapy, ask your therapist about it. Another part of this is learning to practice dependence. Now, don't go out willy-nilly and find people who are unlikely to be able to show up for you when you need them to be. Go out and try to find some individuals that you can test that dependence with small things and gradually build up. If you find that somebody's not going to be able to handle the small things, then that's an indication that they may not be able to likely handle the bigger things. It's not going to benefit you if you are asking people who are not able to show up for you and to help be dependent on them a little bit if they're not able to do that. So you want these healthy relationships to kind of start where you can start practicing a little bit of dependence. And with that is also the ability to practice accepting help. I am awful at accepting help. People will offer to help me all the time, and I'm like, no, I've got it. And I don't ask for help either, which is why probably 90% of my household projects are screwed up, because I won't ask for help, and I'm going to do it myself, and even if somebody offers me help, I'm probably going to decline it anyway. It's really important to start learning to accept help when it's offered, and you can start with the smaller things. So if somebody's willing to, help you load groceries in the car, that's a pretty small thing that you can probably learn to accept help with. Every time I have to accept help, it feels like my skin is crawling and I am incredibly uncomfortable doing so. Just like I'm incredibly uncomfortable accepting compliments. But these are all things that have to be learned over time through having what we call corrective emotional experiences. Things where it's a positive emotional experience that conflicts with the negative that you've had in the past, to teach you that you can actually go ahead and do these things now because it's actually safe now. Another thing is communicating needs. Dismissive avoidants don't always communicate their needs real well, and so they can be people pleasers at times, or they can just set this like rigid, hard boundary of no. Um, Being able to communicate what you actually need is really important, and something that you might want to do with your therapist is working on identifying those needs within your relationships, because it might be really struggling. It might be a real struggle, or you might be having trouble identifying your needs and then would therefore have difficulty communicating them. Trying out vulnerability, again, do this with a relationship that you do have pretty solid and secure already, because trying at that vulnerability, we want it to be a positive experience. And this is where a therapist can kind of help you get started with that, because there's probably nothing you can say or come up with in therapy that's really going to shock me or ruffle my feathers at all. So you can be vulnerable with me, even if it's small to start with. And that's going to be perfectly okay. I'll support you in that. And then when you get out into the real world and you're starting to practice this, at least then you have a kind of a model to compare to, like, oh, hey, this feels similar to when I opened up with my therapist, or hey, this is a similar experience to another positive relationship that I had. Offering self-compassion is also a necessary goal that needs to be on that list. Right now, my therapist is trying very hard to get me to learn self-compassion. And my brain is fighting that every single moment of the day. And she and I battle it out very nicely, because I do not want to have that self-compassion. It's really difficult for me, but it is a skill that I need to learn. So I'm trying. Work on practicing genuine listening. The number one thing that I say to people all the time, it's unbelievable how much I say this, is too often we are listening to defend our position rather than listening to understand the other person's experience. We really, really need to try to shift to learning to understand someone else's experience. That's what we're listening for. Listening to defend means that I'm actually not really listening to the whole experience. I'm listening to the points that I'm going to use to either support or counteract my argument, rather than listening to what's happened to somebody else. Which is so funny, because when I meet people from different cultural groups out in the real world, I am all ears. Like, if I could ask 1,000 questions to understand their experience, I would, because I love hearing these experiences, these stories that individuals have. But when it comes to a potential conversation between me and somebody else, I get stuck in it too. I listen to defend at times rather than listen to understand. Practice sharing. For dismissive avoidance, they may share surface level details. It's time to start deepening that a little bit, and you can do it just like the same as if you're digging a hole in your yard. I had to dig a trench for a retaining wall last summer, and I did it in layers. So take off the top layer, now take off the next layer beyond it, now the next layer below that. So you can practice sharing some of those vulnerable details by starting with the shallow stuff first. Also, work on your emotional expression. You do need to be able to communicate both verbally and non-verbally what your emotional experience is, and that can take some time and practice. So you can do that one in therapy, but you can start practicing it on your own with the relationships that are supportive in your life. Finally, assess your relationships, your current relationships. Remember, as you change, grow, and heal, not everyone is meant to come on to the next chapter of your life. And I know that's so painful. And the first time I heard that, my heart was breaking, because I knew damn well that there were some relationships that were exiting my life that I really didn't want to let go of. But sometimes that has to happen. So if you're a dismissive avoidant and you're in relationships that are not emotionally supporting you and they're not going to be healthy relationships, you're going to need to reassess them and determine whether or not they should be moving on to the next part of your life as you go through this healing journey. Information on examples of things that I have seen, and I'm going to take you back for a moment. The anxious preoccupied, when they get triggered, they have a tendency to hyperactivate and pull closer to their partner. The dismissive avoidant, when they get triggered, have a tendency to deactivate and withdraw from their partner. So you could see how this would create a little bit of problem. And when we talk about the EFT couples dances and we talk about, the pursuer, the withdrawer, one withdraws, the pursuer gets more activated and then they pursue, and the avoidant typically gets more triggered and more deactivated and they withdraw, and we have this chase that goes on. Yes, I've seen that happen. It's kind of wild to watch, because what's happening is both individuals are focusing on their partner rather than themselves and understanding their part in this dance. So if you can get to that point where you realize, oh, I'm shutting down and deactivating, and that's triggering to my partner, and you can re-engage into that relationship and come a little bit closer, that's huge. If the pursuer can realize that, hey, I'm feeling triggered and I'm getting activated and I'm pursuing and I need to cool off a little bit, that's huge. If both partners can do it, we can have a very different outcome than what we started with. But when it comes to dismissive avoidance and some of the things that I've seen, one of the things that I've observed is it usually is going to take about 3 to 6 months for that attachment bond to strengthen enough to a point where they can get triggered. And once then they're triggered, it's usually going to have one of two outcomes. Usually, there will be a discard at some point, but it can happen where they slowly start to cool off in the relationship until the point where they get so overwhelmed that they run. So if you remember the original example that I gave when I was observing all of this stuff at 16 years old, and I put people into two categories. They were either what I called a runner or a player, or they were a clinger or a puppy dog. Those clingers, puppy dogs, was what I later learned was the anxious preoccupied group. The runners player group was the dismissive avoidant group. And that is because, again, to me, it looked like these individuals were playing games. They would get close, too close, back up a little bit, and then eventually they would run. They would just cut bait and run from the relationship for no apparent reason that seemed to even make sense. So when I've seen this happen, a lot of times I've actually seen it occur within the discards. Not just my own experience, but from friends, from family. As soon as they get too triggered, they will cut bait and run from that relationship, and they'll actually deactivate. So I'll go through a little bit more of that when I talk about the breakups and the relationships, but just to kind of give you a little bit of perspective of, again, the titles that I had was describing behaviors that I was observing. I didn't understand all the underlying factors that were going on, but a lot of times those underlying factors are completely dependent on what's going on with the person's nervous system based on what they learned about relationships in their childhood. So that's a little bit of information on the dismissive avoidant. Again, we're just going through the foundations of the attachment styles so that we can see how it actually shows up in our relationships, what we're doing, how this plays in with neurobiology, with trauma, and how it's all together. And we have one more attachment style to go.